दौत बंदन अनक बार सर्व कला समरथ डोलन ते रखो प्रभु नानक दे कर हाथ फिरत फिरत प्रभ आया पर तो सरनाए नानक की प्रभ बेनती अपनी भगति लाए नानक की प्रभ बेनती अपनी भगति लाए वाहिगुरु जी का खालसा वाहिगुरु जी की फतेह. So Sad Sangat Ji, with Guru's Kirpa, we're tuning in now to the third part of this series, in which we'll be looking at the events that took place in the first week of June 1984, in particular the days of the 3rd and 4th of June. So just firstly, just wanted to make an apology to the Sangat and to Guru Sahib. Yesterday there was a slight mistake in the naming of Bibi Amarjit Kaur, who is in fact the wife, the Singhani of Bhai Singh Ji Shaheed, and not Bhai Mandeep Singh Ji, as mentioned yesterday. So apologies for that misunderstanding. So just a quick recap from what happened yesterday and what we've looked at so far from the events leading up to 1984, and also the first 2 days of the Battle of Sri Harimandar Sahib. So we looked at the tensions that grew due to the discrimination upon Punjabis and Sikhs from 1947 up until 1994, which resulted in the Sikhs asking for their rights in the form of an Anandpur Sahib resolution formulated and confirmed in 1978, and then that falling upon deaf ears, and then the Sikhs led by Sant Jarnail Singh Ji, who was the spiritual leader at the time, in 1982 starting a peaceful physical agitation known as the Dharam Yudh Morcha, and all of that had also again fallen upon deaf ears, which led to the Indian army actually attacking the Sikh temple, as known as Sri Harimandar Sahib, on June the 1st, 1984, with preparations being made from up to 2 years earlier than that in 1982, with the help of other countries such as the UK and Israel. So yesterday we looked at the first Shaheed, who was Bhai Mandeep Singh Ji Babbar, and the state of Chardi Kawal that he was in, and also the inspiration it gave other Sikh fighters, other Sikh defenders at the time. So today we'll be looking at the 3rd and 4th of June, and in particular what happened on those days. Now these days are important because this is when the artillery fire begins. So on the 3rd of June, as mentioned in previous videos, it's a very memorable day because in 1984, the Shahidi, the martyrdom of Guru Arjan Dev Ji Maharaj fell on the 3rd of June, when Guru Arjan Dev Ji Maharaj was Shaheed in 1606 due to the tyranny that was being brought upon by the Mughal Empire at the time. And every year, this is a massive day in Sikh calendars all across the world. And as you can probably expect, even more so at a Gurdwara like Sri Harimandar Sahib. So people had been coming over the past few days in preparation for this celebration, and accounts write that there were around 20,000 people in Sri Harimandar Sahib on the 3rd and 4th of June. In addition to that, as mentioned in previous videos, there was an agitation where, due to the Dharam Yudh Morcha, one of the agitations was that the Punjab state was going to stop all grain exports and also its distribution of water and electrical resources. And because of that, another 1,300 people would come to aid in that protest and to join in on that protest, that morcha. So we had up to 20 to 30,000 people in Sri Harimandar Sahib complex at that time. So thousands are trapped, and at this point, exits are shut off after another 36-hour curfew is imposed. And in addition to just the curfew conditions, a shoot-on-sight policy is relayed out across Punjab, so that the police brutality was a lot stronger having imposed this. Now, one thing I'd just like to mention at this point are a few sources that talk about these days, and in particular, Amia Rao from the Citizens for Democracy, who are a non-profit organization that look at injustices across the world, as they did in 1984. And she describes that innocent people were slaughtered like rats, first letting them enter the complex, then declaring curfew, which prevented them getting out, Thousands were caught unaware, and finally, when the survivors were asked to surrender, they were shot in cold blood. So this is one of the deceptive tactics that the government and the people running the state of Punjab at that time used in order to get as many people in the site, in the complex of Sri Harimandar Sahib at the same time, in order to create the most casualties as possible. And as you mentioned earlier, in yesterday's videos, this was not attack on a handful or a sprinkle of militants that had so-called occupied the Harmandir Sahib, or so-called started to fledge a political movement in order to get their own country. This was a direct attack on Sikh psyche and the tenets of the Sikh faith. In addition, someone from the Associated Press, known as Brahma Chalani, personally witnessed on June 3rd and 4th at least 13 people, innocent members of the Sangat, killed. And he describes the way that they were coerced into leading themselves to their own death. And they were said that they were made to surrender, and then the stars were taken off their heads and used to tie their hands as handcuffs behind their hands before they were shot. And he also witnessed at least 200 army personnel shot, which shows us that the type of resistance that was coming from the Singhs and Singhniya, led by General Subeg Singh and led by Sant Jarnail Singh Ji, from the complex. And very shortly after this announcement he'd made and this account he'd been given, he was charged with sedition, and he wasn't allowed to talk about the rest of the things he saw. So the killings have begun, and the killings have ramped up due to this curfew and making as many people as possible stay within the complex so that they can afford as many casualties as possible. But at the same time, the Singhs and Singhni are fighting back, and there are many casualties from the army side as well. So now if we focus our attention towards June the 4th, at this point, as mentioned, we've got at least 20 to 30,000 people stuck in the complex. And on June the 4th, the electric supply and also the water supply to Sri Harimandar Sahib has been cut. Now, for any of you that have been to India throughout April to September will know how hot it is. In particular, the months of May and June are particularly the hottest. So being in Harimandar Sahib in small rooms with dozens of other people and not having access to electricity, so no pakke, no AC, and also no water, is horrendous on the nicest of days. So you can imagine the state that the average person is being held captive in those days. And at 4 a.m., the army starts shelling. They start using artillery on the 4th of June. And Gyani Kirpal Singh, who we mentioned previously, from his eyewitness account, says that his house was very closely located next to Sri Harimandar Sahib. And whilst he was reading his Swir, the Nithanim, his morning prayers, at 4:40, he himself heard 12 non-stop rounds of artillery directed towards Sri Harimandar Sahib. And this barrage continues until the 6th of June. And this continues without any stop, and most importantly, without any warning to the people in Sri Harimandar Sahib. So we've mentioned how people are being kept in horrendous conditions, and we'll talk a little bit more about this with an eyewitness account in a few minutes' time. In addition, innocent people, in particular the Kirtanis, people doing seva at Sri Harimandar Sahib, were killed innocently. Two names to mention are Kirtanis Avtar Singh, who was a 65-year-old blind Ragi at the time, and Amrik Singh, who was shot as they were leaving Sri Harimandar Sahib after doing the Asa Diwal role in the morning. Now, what's also important is the amount of casualties that happened and the innocents that were shot as they were leaving Harimandar Sahib or around the Harimandar Sahib area, which is the actual Gurdwara part in the midst of the Sarovar. Because on the 6th of June, the white paper from the Indian Army actually states that there's no evidence to suggest that there was any firing coming from Sri Harimandar Sahib, which raises the worrying question as to if there were no shots coming out of Sri Harimandar Sahib, why on earth was the army targeting it? Now, at 12 o'clock midday on the 4th of June, we also see something very inspiring as well. In yesterday's talk, we mentioned this call to the Sikh Panth, this hukam that was given by Sant Jarnail Singh Ji in their last known speech, and also from the Singh Sahib Singh, and also the Jathedar Gyani Kirpal Singh, who issued a hukamnama, an edict, order, a command from Akal Takht, calling all local Sikhs to come and defend Sri Harimandar Sahib. And after hearing this call, 30,000 villagers across Punjab gathered towards Sri Harimandar Sahib and get to a village called Gohiwal. And as they were marching towards Amritsar, they picked up whatever they can in order to defend their home and their Sikhi in every respect. They're armed with karpana and anything that they can get their hands on. Now, as they get to village Gohiwal, there are police intersections set up all around Amritsar so that anyone coming in or going out is checked by the police firsthand. And in essence, only police officers or army personnel or government officials were allowed in or out. It was closed to the majority of the public. Now, General Sundarji, along with General Bra, who were the two generals leading this attack, he authorizes deadly fire and allows the use of deadly fire to disperse these crowds. And we hear from accounts that up to 100 people were shaheed as they were making their way to Sri Harimandar Sahib to defend it. So that, in a very short summary, is the events that occurred on the 3rd of June and the 4th of June. So we see many innocents starting to be shot and made shaheed, Raggis that were just simply performing their Kirtan duty, that had no armor and were not shooting towards the Indian army, killed, innocents that are being kept in horrendous conditions, and also people that are asked to surrender, then shot in cold blood soon after. But at the same time, we have the Khalsa, the might of the Khalsa, and just short of 250 Khalsa soldiers fighting back towards the army and also inflicting damage to the Indian army. So I just want to address two misconceptions for today. And the first one of which is that the Sikhs had a chance to surrender. This is a narrative that's quite oftenly claimed by Indian nationalists or people that have opposing views, or people that just haven't read into the Itihas or the politics of 1984 very much. And one of the main claimants of this is General Sundarji, who I mentioned earlier. And in 1993, in his review of what actually happened in Operation Blue Star, himself being one of the leading generals on this, he quotes that we went inside with humility in our hearts and prayers on our lips. Now, Sad Singh Ji, from what we've learned so far, we know that this couldn't be further from the truth. But let's take it away from my personal opinions and let's look at the facts and let's look at what's been reported on this quote. Now, I mentioned earlier that the Citizens for Democracy, in their report, which is called Report to the Nation, Oppression in Punjab, which was made in Bombay in 1985, they talk about the conditions, and they said that no one inside the Golden Temple had yet realized the sinister plan of the authorities. Punjab had been sealed. Amritsar had been sealed as well. The Golden Temple had been sealed. Thousands of pilgrims and hundreds of Akali workers had been allowed to collect inside the temple complex. They had been given no inkling or warning either of the sudden curfew or the imminent army attack. It was a black hole type of tragedy, not out of forgetfulness, but out of deliberate planning and design. So we hear that this lack of warning was deliberate, and the fact that people claim that Sikhs had the chance to surrender, but the army had to go in and flush them out because they decided not to surrender is total nonsense. And there are many, many claimants to back this up. I mentioned earlier about the living conditions or the conditions people were made and kept captive in within the rooms of Sri Harimandar Sahib. And I just want to draw our attention to an account from a book by Mark Tully and Satish Jacob called Mrs. Gandhi's Last Battle. And in there, Tully and Jacob recount an eyewitness account from a young woman, a young mother of 3 children called Karnar Kaur, who recalls that when people begged for water, some Jawans, referring to soldiers, told them to drink the mixture of blood and urine on the ground. So many people not only died from the brutality of the Indian army and the tyranny of the Indian army, but at the same time died of starvation, or dehydration, and maybe even heat stroke and other effects due to lack of water and also scorching heat in the times of June. And lastly, The Guardian, a very well-respected UK national paper, also claims and also writes about the attack in Sri Harimandar Sahib on June the 13th in 1984. And they say that Sikhs were shot at point blank range, their hands tied behind their backs with their turbans. It was a virtual massacre. A large number of women, children, and pilgrims were gunned down. Again, reinforcing the truth behind what actually happened and how these innocents were made to suffer the brunt of the Indian army. And again, just looking at the comments and recent things that people were discussing around these videos, in particular the live streams we've been doing, I came across another source that quite interestingly refutes or actually gives praise to people that actually defend their honor, as Sant Jarnail Singh Ji, as the Khalsa did in Akal Takht. Because we had quite a few members of Sangat a little bit confused as to why people would take any sort of arms into Sri Harimandar Sahib. So it was addressed a few days ago, but I thought this would be good to share with the Sangat as well. And this was from General Sinha. So General Sinha is a very important name for us as Sikh, especially when looking at this time in 1984. If you remember from yesterday, he was the general that actually rejected the notion of the attack and stepped back and said, I'm not being a part of this. I'm not going to be a part of this genocide that takes place. And he mentions in his own commentary that in view of these military preparations, if Sant Jarnail and his men decided to defend the Golden Temple with all their might and means, no one can and should blame them. You are duty bound to do your all when you know someone is going to raid your house. In this case, the house was the holiest Sikh shrine in the world. All you have to match the adversary's weapons with your own weapons of equal, if not more firepower. This is an acknowledgement of the rule of combat. So General Sinha himself acknowledges that on a basic level, if anyone comes to inflict pain on your home, let alone your holiest shrine, then everyone has the right to pick up arms and defend themselves, as the Sikhs did at that time. Now, speaking of Sant Jarnail Singh Ji, I just wanted to talk about and look a little bit deeper into the personality of Sant Jarnail Singh Ji, and also the build-up for them actually taking this position on as one of the spearhead, one of the leaders of this movement. So if we look at Sant Jarnail Singh Ji's early life, from a very young age, they were attuned to Gurbani, having taken Amrit and joining the Khalsa Panth at the age of 5. They were working in the fields with their father and with their brothers and sisters from a very young age, but that didn't let them stop their connection with Gurbani. And from our history and from sources, we find that they were a very spiritual child and a very spiritual teenager before they actually came into contact with the Damdami Tuksal. And we hear that they would do a Sahaj Path every month. So they would start and complete a Sahaj Path every month. And just to explain, a Sahaj Path is the complete recitation of Sri Guru Granth Sahib Ji Maharaj, which normally takes around 48 hours. Now, for anyone that's tried a Sahaj Path, it takes, in the diaspora, many of us, it takes 6 months, even to a year to complete it. So the fact that Sant Jarnail Singh Ji, in his teenage years, was completing a Sahaj Path every month is something extraordinary, and also backs up how much bhakti and how much seva Sant Jarnail Singh Ji had before taking up and being blessed with this position of leading the Panth in these dark times. Another thing that we hear about Sant Jarnail Singh Ji, and quite a sad propaganda statement that's put out there against them, is that they were against Hindus. Now, against Sant Singh Ji, this couldn't be further from the truth. This is evident from their own speeches and also from the statements of Hindus that have actually interacted with them in terms of the public, and also people that have gone to interview them as well. And one particular story I'd like to highlight, which is quite a famous story about Sant Jarnail Singh Ji, is a story of when a Hindu wife, a newly wedded Hindu wife, came to seek refuge from the Khalsa. So she'd been newly married and her in-laws were exploiting her in order to get money from her parents, from her mother and father. Now, having come from quite a poor background, quite a poor family, she had taken all the money she possibly could from her parents to give to her in-laws. And because she couldn't take any more, her in-laws were treating her in a very bad state and basically discriminating against her because of the fact. Now, her husband also didn't back her up, and this left her in quite a bad state. After asking the police and having nowhere else to turn, as many people in Punjab did at that point, they came to the Sangat, to the Sharan of the Khalsa, and came to Sant Jarnail Singh Ji and the Singhs and Singniya that were there at the time. And as per ancient tradition and custom in Punjab, and even till today in Eastern Asian countries, she grabbed the feet of Sant Jarnail Singh Ji and said, Santi, can you please help me? And she's crying her eyes out. Sant Jarnail Singh Ji brings her up and says, what's the wrong? What's the problem? After explaining her scenario, he says to her, so you're the daughter of a Hindu. Are you willing to be the daughter of a Sikh? Now, this is not to be misinterpreted as Sant Jarnail Singh Ji trying to convert this woman or this young lady. Rather, are you willing to have faith in me as a Sikh and to look after you as a fatherly figure? And she says, Hanji, I am. And at that point, after saying that she's put her faith in Sant Jarnail Singh Ji orders a few armed guards to go and bring that family into their court. After bringing that family, the mother and the father, and also the husband of the young wife, appear and are trembling in fear because they know of the tyranny that they've brought up on this poor young woman. And after saying and seeing Sant Jarnail Singh Ji, at that point, Sant Jarnail Singh Ji throws down a plate. Within that plate, there was countless banknotes with a lot of maya, a lot of money. And Sant Jarnail Singh Ji instructs that family, the mother, the father, and the son, to take as much money as they need. This is my daughter, and don't you ever dare lay another hand on her again. So this is the nature of the Khalsa from the start, which was set to us by Guru Nanak Dev Ji Maharaj. And from the time of 1980 to 1984, we hear many accounts of the armed Punjabi Bande and also women coming to seek refuge from Sant Jarnail Singh Ji in the Khalsa at that point because they had lost faith in the trust of the police. And if you imagine this kind of small government of where the Sikhs are handling their own affairs of the Punjab because the police are not trustworthy enough starts to emerge, and people have immense faith from all backgrounds in Sant Jarnail Singh Ji and also the Singhs and Singniya of the Khalsa. So just a little bit about their Jeevani. From a very young age, they have countless Banis Kant by memory, including Sri Sukhmani Sahib. And we hear that from a very young age, they would be able to sit in one Jonkara, in one sitting, and read Gurbani countlessly for 10 to 12 hours with no break. And just a story to reflect and also highlight the amount of kirpa, the amount of blessing they had bestowed upon them by Guru Granth Sahib Ji Maharaj and by the Gurus, is at one time they were actually doing seva of a Sahaj Path in a local pind. And as is famous in Punjab, and even if it still happens today, the electricity went out. And it was a very hot month in Punjab. It was summertime. So the Singhs accompanying Sant Jarnail Singh Ji and also from the Jatha, they left because the AC, the Pakhe had stopped working in that building. And Sant Jarnail Singh Ji remained. After a few hours, they returned back to see that Sant Jarnail Singh Ji had not moved. And all the lights had been cut out as well. Had it been nighttime, they were surprised as how Sant Jarnail Singh Ji had continued reading Gurbani. One of the Singhs went over and said, Sankji, how are you still reading without any lights? Sant Jarnail Singh Ji looked up at him and smiled and said, what can I say? The words of Gurbani are glowing out to me. And because of this, I've been able to read even within the midst of darkness. So the amount of faith and the amount of gamai, the amount of bhakti and seva that Sant Jarnail Singh Ji had is found in many stories that we hear, a few of which I've just highlighted. So I just want to finish with a few quotes from Sant Jarnail Singh Ji, just in order to eradicate the doubt or the false propaganda that's being spread, especially around these times in 1984. We hear countless even news outlets 2 or 3 days ago putting Sant Jarnail Singh Ji in the wrong light. So us as Sikh, it's our duty to put the great Sikh of the 20th century in the correct light and tell our own narrative. So Sant Jarnail Singh Ji was famous for revitalizing Sikhi in Punjab, and spoke out about social and economic problems in Punjab whilst they had the platform. In particular, the problem with drugs, alcohol, pornography, the cutting of hair, the attack on Punjabi language, and also the attack on Sikhi, in particular the dilution that was being introduced by the right-wing Hindu nationalists at the time. And one of their famous accounts, one of their famous sayings is referring to this claim that they're a terrorist. And Sant Jarnail Singh Ji says that Indira, referring to Indira Gandhi, and Congress have labeled me as a terrorist. If getting Sikhs to take Amrit and stay away from drugs, alcohol, meat, and abstain from trimming their hair and beards, defending the honor of our sisters, and spilling the blood of the Shaheed is the work of a terrorist, then yes, I am a terrorist. On the notion of Sant Jarnail Singh Ji leading this movement, this political movement for a separate country, we hear Sant Jarnail Singh Ji saying that I am not for or against Khalistan, this separatist Sikh state, but if we are given a separate Sikh nation, we will not make the same mistake as in 1947. We will certainly take it. But the forefront of what Sant Jarnail Singh Ji was leading for, and the Sikhs at the time were protesting for, was Sikh rights and Punjabi rights. A book I'd like to mention, written by A.R. Darshi, which is here, which is called The Gallant Defender, which is something I'd highly recommend. And in terms of this book, the reason I want to pay particular attention to this is because of who's writing it. Now, A.R. Darshi was a successful member of the Indian government for many years, and he wrote this book after retiring for obvious reasons. And on retiring, he retired as a joint secretary of Punjab. So this is no standard journalist. This is someone that saw the truth in the whole political movement and was brave enough to actually speak the truth about this great soldier, Sant Jarnail Singh Ji. And he says that Sant Jarnail Singh Ji revived the tradition started from the time of Guru Nanak Dev Ji Maharaj and progressively built on by each Guru. And he says that he himself, A.R. Darshi, acknowledges the tradition started by Guru Hargobind Sahib Ji Maharaj of keeping arms and defending ourselves through physical means when everything else has failed. And a quote I'd like to take from his book is that Sant Jarnail Singh Ji simply revived this tradition in letter and spirit and gave it a new dimension by substituting revolvers and guns with swords and spears and motorcycles with horse. He did therefore not commit any offense by following the Gurus. The cynics may criticize him for revival of the age of the tradition of the Khalsa. So his words still ring true today. And it's important because this isn't coming from myself as Mandeep Singh. This isn't coming from another Sikh. This is coming from the retired Joint Secretary of Punjab. So please do check out this book because it's an amazing source, an amazing insight to the nature and the politics of Sant Jarnail Singh and 1984 at the time. So I just want to finish with a rounding quote from Sant Jarnail Singh Ji themselves, actually saying what his mission is, what their mission was in this whole time frame. And it's important to remember that they did not find themselves in this powerful place straight away. They studied for 13 years and did Seva for 13 years in Damdami Tuksal before becoming the leader of Damdami Tuksal in 1977. And then they had at least 7 years of experience before the attack, 7 years of research, and 7 years of trying to plead with the government and also take means in a peaceful way, which all failed and led to what happened in June. So the last quote I'd leave you all with from Sant Jarnail Singh Ji themselves is that my admission is to administer Amrit, to explain the meaning of Gurbani, and to teach Gurbani to those around me, and to tell people that a Hindu should be a firm Hindu, a Muslim should be a firm Muslim, and a Sikh should be a firm Sikh. And he also said that if we speak to someone with hatred and try to assert our superiority, it will create hatred in the minds of everyone. So as long as we have the spirit of love, so as long as we have the support of Satguru Hargobind Sahib Ji Maharaj, the master of Miri Piri, is there any power on earth that can subdue us? So hopefully that final quote will leave you with a true indication of the reality of Sant Jarnail Singh Ji's persona and also their actual mission compared to the mission that was painted out by the Indian propaganda machine continually today and also in the times of 1984. So while speaking, Sadh Sangat Ji, I would have made many mistakes. Tomorrow, I ask for the Sangat and Guru Sahib for forgiveness. Tomorrow we'll look at the battle in a little bit more detail over the days of the 5th and 6th of June, in particular when commandos and army personnel start attacking on foot and how the Khalsa retaliated and the amazing feats they overcame in those days. And also in the following days, we'll look at what happened after the fighting's finished and also the continued attacks without guns, without tanks that came about. And we'll also hear of the amazing shaheediyah of people ranging from elderly men, from middle-aged women, and also from 2 bibiyan as young as age 8 and 6. So as finish, as I always will, with the saying of Guru Nanak Dev Ji Maharaj, that whoever has been established by the true Guru, no one can dare to ever overcome them, as our history has told us, and as the Saka of 1984 continues to display to us. जिन को सतगुरु थापिया इन मेट ना सके कोई। वाहिगुरु जी का खालसा, वाहिगुरु जी की फतेह।